You're recording, Nadia.
Oh, fantastic. Well, hello, everyone. Again, my name is Nadia Paps, and I'm co-chair of the subcommittee. Today is May 20th, 2021, and it's 4:03 p.m. And with that, I'm going to kick off today's meeting. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. This is an exciting meeting to have. It's a particularly special milestone for the important work that we've been doing, with an opportunity for us to review our draft principles and potentially send that out for broader subcommittee review and engagement. And so the first thing that we have on our agenda today is a land acknowledgement that Kaya has so kindly volunteered to lead.
So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to provide this land acknowledgement, recognizing that this is a process that as a state, as communities, that we're still undergoing and understanding more deeply about what it means, that it's meant to be a living expression and a recognition of the land on which we are currently situated. It has everything to do with honoring the legacies of those that have been here in the past, those that are currently still here as their energy is vibrant throughout time span, as well as recognizing the land and earth around us and the ways that we need to caretake for it. So I'm speaking to you today from Indakana, which is Abenaki, unceded on Abenaki territory. And when I think about the land that's here and the beauty and the work that I must do to preserve that, I'm blessed to be able to have a gorgeous view of Lake Champlain, which has been marred so much by pollution and water runoff that I have to go through a whole ritual to be able to go into the water and not break out into a horrible rash that lasts for months. I see this water as part of an essential part of Chittenden County. I see this water as a life-giving ecosystem that's necessary for so much beyond its beauty, beyond its the ability to be a part of an ecosystem. It's used for tourism. It impacts so much, and it is impacted by so much, and it is so fragile. I can look around and see that there's been a lot of development in the area, and so we don't necessarily have the trees that we would like to have, and we can see that the insects are struggling to try to find places to be, and so they want to land on me. What we're able to do in this moment is honor and recognize where we are, who we are, and the gifts that are given to us by the land that we are actually within. So thank you for joining me in this land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Kaya. That was amazing. The next item we have is the check-in. So in the interest of time, particularly since we have so much important and meaningful work ahead of us in the next couple of hours, if everyone could just drop their name in the chat box, that will serve as our introductions today. I'm very excited again and grateful for everyone for being here. We also move now to the approval of the agenda. David dropped that in the chat box, but real quickly, we are going to have a member spotlight was scheduled for today. Unfortunately, Virginia was unable to join us due to another commitment. So we're going to hopefully spotlight that in the coming weeks. We'll then have an opportunity to finalize our draft guiding principles, reflecting some important work that we've done in the last couple of days, really as a reflection of some meaningful discussions that we've had as part of this subcommittee. We will then have public comment on that drafting process, which will be followed by an update from Climate Access and RISE. We'll have a report back from other subcommittees, steering committee, and the full council. We will then have public comment and adjourn. And we also have the minutes which were sent via email by Sarah. Does anyone have any comments, feedback on the agenda or the minutes? Hearing none, I will call them approved.
No, Nadia, I'm sorry. For some reason, the minutes did not get posted, actually, so from the 13th. So I think we can't actually approve those, but the minutes were posted from the week prior, which I think we maybe need to get caught up on. So hopefully those are the minutes that people reviewed and were approving.
Okay, so for clarity, what's the date on those? Do you recall, for the ones prior to the 5/6?
Yeah, the ones that are posted are from May 6th.
I see. Okay. So again, hearing none, we are approving those. And again, we sorely miss Virginia today, so we're going to skip over the member spotlight and then dive right into finalizing our draft guiding principles. And David, thank you so much for facilitating today's discussion on them.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. And hello, everybody. And for those who I don't know, my name is David Plum, and I work with an organization called the Consensus Building Institute. And I'm helping with my team provide facilitation support for the overall Climate Council process. And I think I know everybody on this call, except for Eris. I don't think you and I have had a chance to talk before, so it's nice to meet you virtually at least. Okay. So you have seen over email likely, and you can also link straight from the chat, a very, I would say impressive document that really is the culmination of several meetings of your work that a variety of folks spent the last 5 days trying to synthesize down into a document. And that's what was shared around. There was a couple versions shared around. The most recent one should be the one that links in on the agenda. So you can click right through the agenda, or maybe someone could drop it in the chat if they have it handy, the link that goes straight to that document. And if you are a member of the public with us today that didn't get that, you didn't get an email, this is the document we'll be reviewing today. Before we go into it, let me just say what I think our hope is today and what we talked about with the co-chairs. Our hope is that by the end of our meeting today, we have a punch list of improvements to this document or refinements to this document that allows us to all feel comfortable, or you all as members of this Just Transition Subcommittee, to feel comfortable making those changes, have your co-chairs make the changes from our punch list, and then send it on to the subcommittees in the spirit of a draft document that needs feedback, but can also already start to guide the subcommittees in their work and to put this equity and justice lens on the work. So that's our intent for today. End the day with the punch list of changes that you think need to happen to this document that are manageable to make happen. Co-chairs, go ahead and do that with help from anybody. And then this document sometime early next week gets sent out to all the subcommittees. That's what we're thinking. Let's see how it goes. If sort of more major surgery is needed, then we'll take the time that's needed to do that. But that's the intent. Okay. Instead of pulling up the document itself, I've made a little PowerPoint that helps sort of synthesize what's in it and maybe a good way to walk through. And since there was a whole collection of folks that spent the last 5 days trying to pull this together, I'm going to tap those folks as well in explaining how things came together in certain ways. And as we go, if folks have comments and questions and concerns, let's start to make that punch list of changes we'd like to see to the document. All right. So that's what I plan to do. I will share my screen. Again, I see Sarah, I think, dropped in the chat. Yeah, the most recent version. So everybody, if you want to see the full text, that's where it is. The other thing I want to do as we go here is I want to give people time to actually sit and read and think for a little bit. So if we have a little moments of silence tonight, that's probably a good thing, and we can collect our minds on it. Okay, here we go. So here's the doc. I just literally, did a cut and paste of the table of contents here, but this is what's inside your document, right? These 6 things, although the 6th is a placeholder, we actually don't have resources in there yet, but at some point they'll get in there. The 5 key pieces. There's an introduction that sort of lays out context. There's a definitions section of key terms. There's a definition section around impacted and frontline communities. There's draft guiding principles. And then there's these, what we're calling self-assessment questions, right? Questions that subcommittees can ask themselves that are meant to be quite actionable, that pull from the principles and turn them into something that the subcommittees can really say, oh yeah, this is what I need to be asking myself right now. Okay. Those are the 5 things we have. At some point, resources might get plugged in, but we're not going to hold ourselves up for that just yet. Okay. So let's go into the first piece of this. And please shout out if you want me to clarify something or you want to go into the document itself that has the content. Okay.
David,
Yeah, go ahead.
this is Sue, and I just kind of wanted to remind everyone that, in this is really everything is made from and around the words that we as a group put on a page together. Everything, and we've really sifted through quite a few times the key guiding principles. And you may, if you weren't here, we also had a whole session devoted to the kinds of questions we use the Jamboard. So just a reminder that really this isn't coming from outside, this is coming from all of us. And I think we made a bit of a leap from where it was to this point, because we really wanted to put it all together in a form that really read well and could be digested, that was synthesized. So I just wanted to mention that we've kind of leapt forward, and we definitely hope that feels true to the words and the spirit and the wishes of this group. But it was a bit of a leap, and that's what we're hoping to keep going on. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. That's really important. And to that point, I think if you can't see that language in those key ideas that we've been putting out, like physically on Jamboards and elsewhere in these weeks, if you can't see it in this, then that's the things we need to fix tonight for sure. Did I hear someone trying to get in? I might have spoken over somebody. Okay. So
sorry. Hi, I'm here on my phone. It's Kashka. I just came in, so I don't know if you heard me, David.
I didn't. Go ahead.
Sorry about that.
Oh yeah.
Just hello. Hello.
Okay,
everybody.
great. Welcome. I'm glad you're here with us. Okay.
Thank you, David.
Yeah. So the introduction has these three things. It has some context about the sort of the statute and the intent of the document. It goes over the content that's in the document. And then it has this thing that was born from the conversation we had last week with Judy, Dow, with Beverly and others about this bigger perspective and based on Indigenous knowledge and learning. And this is something where we need to pause because I think those of us who were involved, co-chairs and others in drafting this, really want to make sure we hit this in the way you all want to hit this. And I'm not seeing Beverly in the audience right now or Judy. But what's in the document is a quote from the Indigenous Principles of Just Transitions from the Indigenous Environmental Network that we thought was reflective of the conversation and the ideas that came up. And we're just not sure, right, that we're hitting it the way it needs to be done. And if we don't have the right folks with us tonight to really say that, then we'll put a pause on this and make sure we are checking with the right folks on this. But I will say it's a question mark, I think, for the folks who are drafting. Are we getting this in the way it was intended, in the way it was spoken a week ago? Okay. We put that in the introduction as a sort of framing question. You'll see also that these concepts are in the principles as well. Okay, so that's the introduction, and we can circle back on the issue of, are we hitting it right in terms of the recognition of what we heard last week. In the definition section, there are definitions around equity, breaking it up in those 4 components of equity. Distributive equity, procedural, like how you go about doing things, the contextual equity, the fact that the climate affects people differently. And that's part of the reason why we're here, and also corrective and making sure that harms are corrected and there's ways to address this. And then there's definitions around justice. And we may have improperly mushed together climate and energy in definitions, and maybe they need to be more completely pulled apart. And that's something we welcome thoughts on. But these are definitions that we pulled from, and we tried to cite where we could, and we may need to do a better job of citing the location. Right, so that's what's in the definition section around justice, and equity. Then there's a set of, there's a page about impacted and frontline communities that builds off our conversation last week and the week before. And we offer these sort of 4 overarching criteria, and then used a more sort of image way of framing up. There's a bunch of folks, we're not going to list them out, but there are clearly folks that we are paying attention to, and that are often referred to as frontline or impacted communities in the context of climate and energy and the environment. Okay, so this is in there as well. And there's more language, right? There's quite a bit more language. I'm giving this sort of broad overview, and then we can circle back to the individual places. There's 6 principles that are in the document, and underneath each one are a set of ideas, right, that I'm not listing out here. There's a lot more content in your document than what's here, but this is how they get coalesced into 6 big ideas. And the first one is about the sort of process piece, about the way we engage. The next is about accountability and being restorative. The next one is something that you all really came up with and put some nice language to, that is not seen as much in other definitions. Solidarity, putting the most impacted first, and then of course supporting workers, families, and communities. There's a lot in these 6 that's in the document, and I want to give us some time to read in just a moment so we actually look at some of the content. Finally, at the end, there's a set of questions that are grouped into these sort of 5 buckets of questions, which are basically, have I done the work to understand who impacted and frontline communities are in relation to the specific recommendations I'm putting forward or considering to put forward? Have I done the work to analyze how burdens and benefits are shared or not? Have I engaged in an equitably and just way with frontline and impacted communities on these issues, right? Are there funding and data questions that are really important to understand here? Like, where is really the funding and the investment going? Have I done that work? And then there's some implementation questions and outcome questions. Okay, so that's it. That's what you got. Now, there's a lot of content in there, and I would love to give folks the time to just, sit with some of that content, particularly if you're feeling like, I need to really think about this a little bit more. And we give ourselves some time to sit and think, and we discuss the pieces that we most want to discuss. Okay, so I'm going to drop for a second. And I wonder, when you're looking at this, you may or may not have time to do a detailed read. And I'm curious if folks want to say, just quickly, what area would you most want to really start spending some time tonight talking about? What is it that's really on your mind when you hear me do the summary? And if you got a chance to read through, where do we need to spend some time tonight to get this right and make sure that your words are there and your thoughts are there? Chris, go ahead, please.
I made a couple of tweaks to it. I just wanted to put back in or recognize that one of the principles needs to be implementability of the recommendations, because we're not going to have a just transition if it's primarily aspirational recommendations. So I sent some suggested edits. If you go to your partner account, you should be able to see the specific language.
That's right. Thanks, Chris. And you, in about 2 or 3 locations, you emphasize that point of implementability and the importance of doing things that can be implemented in real, right? So aspirational is good as long as you actually do it. Okay.
And if I guess one of the other specific ones was recognizing that, hopefully the recommendations or that come out will acknowledge who's actually going to be responsible for doing the implementation, and that the recommendations need to take into account the capacity of whatever those entities are to do that work. And that if that at present, those entities don't have the capacity, the recommendations also need to include how to make that capacity happen. So I just wanted to call that out too. And that's it, David.
Thanks, Chris. That's helpful. Okay. So, Sarah?
I'm sorry, David, I missed that. Where Chris is saying he shared feedback, but maybe I missed Chris, if you shared feedback this week, so I'm confused if I'm.
I emailed it to your, did a reply all to your email with the agenda and all for today.
I'm happy to share my screen
Okay.
if you want to see the actual doc that he sent. Hang on a sec.
Sorry, it might just be behind an email today if you did it this afternoon. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, it was right. Yeah, sorry, it was right before the meeting. Yeah.
I'm glad you did, though. Thanks, Chris.
I can
Yeah,
share so you can see it, and just in 1 second. So this is the document with Chris. This is actually an old version of it, but with Chris's edits in it. And some suggestions to mention that in the introduction about the ability to implement, right? So that's one place you could mention it. You can also, I'm just going to scroll. Sorry, it's going to be a little dizzy for a second as I scroll down. I apologize. Inside the actual principle of accountable and restorative, you can mention it here as well. Recommendations can deliver on their promises. They are implementable. And I think there's one more place, Chris, where you put it. Yeah. And that recommendations reflect the capacity of those responsible for their implementation. And where capacity does not exist, include recognition of what must be done. So it's 3 places that are suggested where this concept of implementation get put in there. Okay, great. And if folks want to push back on that or have a different view about that, feel free to do that. Okay. So where would folks like to expend, really put our energy tonight? Where could this document really benefit from some improvement in addition to the idea that Chris puts forward about emphasizing implementation? What else is on people's minds when they saw this document? Do you want some time to read? Because the other thing is we could take a section and just sit and read it for a second. Like the principles, just sit there and read it. Or frontline community definition, sit there and read it for a second. Because I'd be more than happy to do that. If folks want to say, you know what, let's just pause on this section and read for a little bit. Would anybody like that? I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, Nadia? What would be your first place to start? You want to start with, you name it. I'm happy to go wherever you want to go.
I'll just say that there, oh, go ahead, Koshka, sorry.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, you guys. So I'm driving, and whatever section you guys choose, would it be possible if you could read it out loud?
Yeah. And we know that
Would that be
Kaya,
okay?
yeah, I love that. And we may pull on Kaya because she has such a good reading voice. If she's up for it, I don't know. But yes, she says yes, okay. So I wonder if we want to start, I don't know, I'll push it right back out to you all. Where would you most want to spend a little time reading right now?
I would just note that Sarah and Iris, and I believe others, did a really great job of kind of attempting to synthesize the questions or the draft guiding principles in ways that are accessible across audiences. And it might be very valuable for us to see how those revisions went.
On the guiding principles. Yeah. Yeah. I'd say let's do it. Let's read through them. And Kaya, if you're up for it, I mean, it's really great if you could. And if you want to, the link from Sarah in the chat, just above her most recent chats, goes to the draft doc. And if that's helpful, I don't know how your computer's set up right now, but You're still
Yeah,
muted.
so let me just verify what we're doing. So I wanted to just make sure I also acknowledge what Nadia had just requested. So that was around us thinking about the revisions that were made. Is that a separate document or is that incorporated into the one we're looking at now?
I believe you're saying it's the one we're looking at right now, is that there was a big effort to make these principles the way they are in this document.
Okay. All right, so we are seeking to look at our guiding principles, which you can find on page 5 of the document, which will be posted, if not already. So this, and again, this is in draft formation. So these principles set expectations regarding how Vermont's Climate Council, including subcommittees, will conduct their work, what recommendations are made by the council, and how investments, implementation, and oversight of the climate action plans occur. So the first guiding principle is to ensure that this work is inclusive, transparent, innovative, engagement. That's the subheading, the heading for there. I'm gonna just plug in my headphones so you don't get all the street noise. My apologies. There we go. All right, so decision-making, drafting, administration, and oversight allow for all Vermonters to participate. That the council's process and public engagement recognizes that people are experts of their own climate and energy experience. Impacted communities are recognized as a prioritized voice in conversations surrounding equity, climate change, and the effects of specific proposed strategies. Transition planning includes innovative, wide community engagement that includes many different stakeholders and groups. These active participants will define the opportunities at local, state, and/or regional levels. Plans and policies must be clear and understandable to all Vermonters. And that the potential impacts, benefits, and burdens of recommended climate actions are identified and shared with the public. So I'll pause there. Is that helpful, David?
Yeah, that's great. Yes, why don't we do some pausing and say, how's that sounding, folks? This is a package of ideas around the sort of procedural equity piece, right? How we engage. Are there things that folks would want to say about that? Yeah.
I think the one thing that comes to my mind is that I don't see anything in here that mentions the goals, like sharing the goals with the community. Like I see a lot of like what the impacts will be on making changes, but it feels like that also should be shared. You know, for the long term, if we think about generations and generations to come, like what are the goals and what do we want to set them up for? I don't think that's shared in this, and maybe it is later, but I think it should be one of the first things that we talk about. And it might be able to go into, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th bullet point where plans and policies. Yeah, exactly. I said plans or goals, plans, and policies is what I would put in there personally. Otherwise, I think it's pretty great.
Cool. Okay. Excellent. So get that. That makes sense to everybody? See a lot of nodding. Yeah. Okay, great. Why don't we keep going into the next section?
All right, accountable and restorative. Recommendations must provide an opportunity to disrupt and reform unequal power dynamics that reinforce social, economic, and political disparities. Ongoing assessment tools will identify intended and unintended inequities and their root causes. Recommendations must recognize inequality and seek to resolve them using clearly identified strategies. Recommendations must recognize their potential impacts on the whole natural environment, including air, water, soil, and all living things. Pause there.
Great. Reactions? Okay. Why don't we keep rolling and then see if folks are missing things? Hang on one second, Kaya. I think you're still on mute.
Thanks. Moving at the speed of trust. Our candor and honesty are essential for public trust and to prepare business, industry, labor, communities, and families for transition to a sustainable climate future. And our planning and implementation must balance being time-bound and honoring the varied ways of learning, understanding, and agreement that exist in different cultures and communities.
Great. And you guys can feel like you really authored and created this one because it has not shown up in other, sort of principle statements, and it's so important. Okay. Why don't we keep moving? Oh, go ahead. Oh no, it's somebody's dog. Okay. All right, let's keep rolling forward, I guess. Kaya?
David, can I do a quick comment?
Yeah, of course.
I really love the second bullet of moving at the speed of trust, but I'm wondering if there's more prescriptive language that we can add there so that if I am a subcommittee member, I know exactly what I need to do in order to achieve this balance and respect and deference for ways of learning and understanding and agreement to be achieved here.
Yeah. Do people have ideas about what that might look like if we were to take it to that next step and you balance it by, right? Sort of you finish the sentence, you balance it by doing this.
David, if I may, this is Kaya Morris.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
So I'm loving this so far, by the way.
Go ahead, Kashmir.
That's okay, Kai. Oh, okay. So, what I was, is there a way to ask, or it would be nice if we could have like a tangible way to know that they will communicate in more than one way. Like I feel like oftentimes, I've heard, oh, it's been communicated to this and this community in this way. But I feel like, I don't know if we need to kind of make it clear, but that it's communicated in several different ways that are tangible and recognizable, because for some people they may have email, for some people they may do surveys, for some people, so that there's a lot of different various ways to communicate information to certain communities. I don't know if that needs to be said, but it just made me think. Thank you.
Yeah, it can be added into these bullets or a bullet apart, right? What I'm hearing you say is be clear that you need multiple ways because people receive and interact with information in different ways. So you need to recognize you need multiple pathways.
David, I think if I may, this is Kaya Morris, just so that for anyone that's not able to see right now or watch the video of this right now. So what this is striking me as, and I appreciate what Kashka just mentioned because it's something I noticed as well, accessibility. We don't really, we name that very briefly later on, but I don't feel like it's baked in here. And I think that might be part of that piece because a regional entity, a municipal entity can say, we communicated to people that there was going to be a meeting by putting up a public warning in our newspaper and we had it posted at our town hall. And that counts according to the law for us to be able to provide, as our open meeting law, like that's the strictures of that are not useful as a guideline for how to best communicate with the public. So I think what we're seeing here is at a minimum, if we are ensuring that the ways that we are choosing to communicate this information are also centered in accessibility, you know, trying to meet the principles and the thoughts around the, you know, ADA, the American with Disabilities Acts, and the rights that should be afforded to any individuals with disabilities, right? So that would in itself would help give a good, I think, basis, perhaps.
Great. Great. Okay. So
That is
Right.
exactly right, Kaya. Thank you for putting it so eloquently.
Hi, this is Eris, for folks who can't see at the moment. I also agree. So that was something that struck me as I was reading through it, is that there's not a commitment to public education that's clearly stated. And I think that the both of you have hit on even a more deeper commitment of making that education accessible in multiple ways. So I'm wondering if that is the bullet point, is there's a commitment to public education that is ongoing throughout a process or of what might be happening. So
great. As you all are talking, I'm making this punch list, right? And then we're going to look at it at the end and see if we got what we need to. But that's, if you hear me typing away, it's like I'm writing this down, and then we'll see if we got it all.
I also have one other thing. This is Eris again. One other thing from the section above, when we were talking about accountable and restorative, and maybe this is just me not understanding, and maybe this is a good place for clarity. But in the second bullet point, it says ongoing assessment tools will identify intended and unintended inequities and their root causes. I think it's great that we want to identify them, but I'm wondering, where is the action of undoing those inequities? And is that in here? Is that what this next bullet point is trying to say? Because that's kind of what I'm getting, but I don't think that's clear enough in that section. So I think my suggestion would be to say something, we'll identify and seek to rectify any unintended inequities, intended or unintended. Hopefully there are no intended inequities. So that's kind of weird too, but that's what I would say.
Great, thanks. Okay. All right, should we move on? You want to keep reading on the solidarity piece?
Sure. Solidarity. Policies create inclusionary spaces for all traditions and cultures, particularly for Indigenous communities, recognizing them as integral to a healthy and vibrant Vermont.
How's that landing? Why don't we keep going? If we want to come back to it, we absolutely can.
The most impacted first. All recommendations directly identify and support relevant, impacted, and frontline communities. Investments, policies, administration, and oversight tackle the needs of impacted people first, providing the greatest benefits of translations to these communities. Future climate goals must be broad for the well-being of all Vermonters and include targeted strategies for different groups that take into account their specific histories, sociocultural, and economic realities. Where plans and policies create burdens, these burdens are shifted away from impacted communities.
This dovetails very well with the restorative piece above, right? And it's naming it even more clearly of focusing on frontline communities and impacted communities. How are people feeling about this? Is there reactions people are having to it? Okay. Why don't we keep rolling, and then we'll do a pause and say, if there were one thing we would do differently, what would it be? So let's go ahead and do the last one, or the final one.
Okay. Supports workers, families, and communities. Policies and strategies are explicit in their identification of potential and likely impacts on workers, families, and their communities based on the implementation of Vermont's Climate Action Plan. Recommendations include transition plans to respond comprehensively to protect impacted workers, including those that are seasonal, clerical, and part-time. Transition plans are based on the needs and aspirations of workers, unions, and disproportionately impacted communities. Plans will support diverse economic regeneration and spur creation of well-paying jobs with benefits. Recommendations will promote strong, equitable labor standards, support access to unionization, and improve access to public services, particularly for groups most disproportionately impacted. Job training programs for impacted and new workers must be led to meaningful, life-sustaining, valued work.
Okay. Great. So taken together, they're a pretty powerful set of principles. You've already made some comments, or let me take this for, actually, before I go there. On this last section, initial reactions, I look, to some of you that are particularly experienced in this area, whether it's Danielle or others. I'm looking for your thoughts on this. If there are improvements that could happen to this section. All good, says Danielle. Excellent.
A thing I'd like to point out, this is Nadia. One thing that if you look at each of the bullets, the first one opens with policies and strategies, the next one with recommendations, the next one with transition plans, the next one with plans, the next one with recommendations, and the next one with programs. And to me, it's confusing because are we specifying specific things that will be subject to this principle, or should there be consistency amongst all of them that say, all of them say policies and strategies, or all of them say recommendations, or anything coming out of the subcommittee should ...
I'm glad you said that, Nadia. And Sarah, I see your hand up. And I will say that I actually tried to go through and change them all to recommendations, but I missed a few. I can see because what I did at the top here, and I welcome thoughts here. I think there's a footnote somewhere. Yes, here, this little footnote right here with recommendations. And the word recommendations refers to the strategies, policies, programs, or other types of recommendations that the Climate Council will make in its action plan. Sarah, did you want to add on to that? Sorry.
Yeah, I think that was a question that our group actually raised, is needing some help with what is the language we wanted to use. Although, and Iris and Abby, correct me if I'm wrong, I did think we wanted to call out job training program and transition plans kind of a little bit separately and more specifically. But the rest of it was kind of like whatever general language we want to use to talk about the plan.
Okay. Chris, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I can't remember what language may have been there before, but to my mind, one of the most important things you can do to support workers, families, and communities is be very, very candid and honest about what those impacts are going to be on workers, families, and communities, so that people can prepare. Because my concern is that oftentimes we talk about climate change or anything else, we just say, okay, we're going to retrain you, and you're going to go out and you're going to find a great job, and everything's going to be okay. Actually, sometimes things won't be okay. Yeah, Sarah, I know it's up above, but I don't think is it in the actual support workers, families, and communities piece? I don't know. I just feel like some acknowledgement's necessary that that it may not be easy. I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer or anything, but I don't want to just, yeah.
I think, Chris, we're trying, and again, I don't know that there's a perfect way to slice and dice this, but we were trying to condense and to synthesize some of these so there was less redundancy, and maybe felt like it fit in this section around moving at the speed of trust. But if it doesn't fit there, I don't have, a personal stake in where it goes. So that's where we.
I think what you, so Sarah, sorry, I missed that. I think that's fine. I'm just wondering if we need to, for a transition to a sustainable climate future, and and I don't know, I guess I'm wondering, and the impacts of that transition. Not trying to over wordsmith, but.
Right, so you get to the idea of like, what are the impacts in that sentence? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris. I'm interested now that we've read through all these. Oh, Kai, do you want to say something?
I do. So I would like to wrap up Chris's piece, and then I have a separate point. So, Chris, I guess I just want to clarify. So, what you're thinking is down in the later section that it's maybe restated differently, that it's just again, a recognition or a, an explanation, just rewording that basic principle once again differently to say that that's who should also just reminding folks that that's part of that process.
Well, I think where Sarah put it, I think it's okay. And I read it when I was looking at this earlier. I guess somehow I'd missed that. I think it's okay unless others feel differently now that I brought it up. But I think it's okay. I just, again, it's kind of just based on lived experience. You see a lot of promises and things aren't always sunshine and roses like people say it's going to be. That's all. And I'm not trying to be down about it. I'm just trying to be candid about, it's not always that easy. So that's not an escape valve either. It's recognizing that you really do have to engage and prepare. So maybe I think where Sarah moved, I think it's fine, unless others disagree.
Hi, I'm so sorry, you guys. I have no idea how to raise my hand on my phone thing.
Hi.
It's Kashka. I'm kind of in the same boat, I think, as Chris in some sense, because what I'm thinking, and I also don't want to be a Debbie Downer on any of this, but I'm hoping that, breadcrumbs wouldn't be thrown out. And there you go. We're supporting the diverse, the needs of impacted or different communities. Here's some breadcrumbs. Sure we are. We're doing it. But it's kind of arbitrary. And I wonder if we need to be a little bit more concise in, for example, saying that, not only, just like we were saying with job training, but what does that really mean? It's not going to be easy. And also, what kind of plans do we have? How are they going to support these communities in a sense, or benefit them if, say 20% of what's happening will benefit them, but these communities should just be happy with that. So how would we define that or make sure that it's more than that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so thank you, Kashka. Yeah, that's kind of where I was going. I didn't get a chance to finish my thoughts. I appreciate that. So, and I agree with you. I think that we've done a pretty good job of building that in throughout the whole, when you look at the document in its totality, which will be important to translate back. So I think that maybe in that first bullet, that might be a place to add a few more words or a little bit of something. Nope, go back down to support workers. You're fine there. That first bullet that talks about the policies and strategies are explicit in their identification of potential and likely impacts on workers, families, and the communities. I think that's great. I don't know if there needs to be a little bit more there, but I think that that's pretty good. The question I had was the fourth bullet down, plans will support diverse economic, that one. What are the plans? Is it transition plans or is that one that should be recommendations?
Recommendations.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah, job training is great. But how are people supposed to survive if they're in a class that, say, runs for 12 weeks? Does there need to be something in there about providing stipends for them while they're going through job training. Most people I know that are working at minimum wage, if they're going to train for a higher paying job, they still have to pay their rent and they still have to feed their kids. And so, you know, what kind of language can we put in there that recommends that, you know, that is something that should be considered and covered for impacted communities? That's just something that strikes me as I'm reading it.
Yeah, we can absolutely put that language in. Eris, and then I see some hands here.
I think what I'm gathering as people are speaking is that there's not, that maybe there needs to be, when recommendations are made, that they need to come with a list of the commitments that are being made to the community. So that's the first thing, like, what are your commitments to supporting this community through this recommendation? Are you providing stipends? You know, like my grandmother just said, are we making sure that people are getting access to continuing job training and not just initial job training that gets them in the door? What's the continuation of development in that case? So I think I'm just hearing like there needs to be commitments that are recommended within the recommendations from different groups. Or we need to have commitments within this document that says this is it. They have to include this. So I don't know, but that's what I'm hearing like I'm missing is the solid commitment.
I like that.
Great. Okay, Amanda, I saw you dropped your hand. Did you want to get in on something?
It was mostly covered. I don't know if it would behoove us to specifically acknowledge that there will be people who are affected in negative ways, and just that acknowledgement. And I kind of saw that might be room for that in the last bullet. Let's say something like there, and we acknowledge that there might be those who are negatively impacted.
Yeah. I wonder if the first bullet in this section does that or not quite, or.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's why I kind of put my hand down, because when I think it was Kaya that called that out, I said, oh, okay, that's kind of falls under the explicit wording there.
Great. Chris, is that a new hand or an old hand? Old hand. Okay, great. Okay, so I wonder, folks who haven't weighed in at all yet on the committee, when you look at these principles, are there things that you'd still want to do to refine them, improve them? Kelly?
Thank you. There was some language that Iris, I think, suggested last week about how the status quo is by definition is just not going to be equitable, and just stating like that we shouldn't just let that continue. And I wondered if that should go in the accountable and restorative section a little bit more explicitly. And I was waiting to read through all of it to see if I saw it there called out explicitly, and I liked the language that she had. So I mean, I know there's a lot that gets near that point, but I didn't know if that was something we wanted to put back in to make the point more clearly.
Yeah, it's not in there. So it ended up in, I'm not weighing in on the opinion, but just kind of what happened to that language. We had an intro section for this draft principles. It was in that intro section, and then realized as part of the whole document that intro section was really met by other parts of this document, and so it got taken out. That's what happened to it. We may want to incorporate that language back into the front of this section, but just to say that's what happened to it. That's how it disappeared.
So can we just assume there's a way to get that back in some way, maybe strengthening the first bullet to say something about the fact that the status quo, we recognize today the status quo is inherently inequitable. I'm I'm not sure what the language was. I can't remember. Was that it?
Maybe Iris remembers more clearly. I thought it was great, whatever it was. And I remembered it, that it was good, but I don't remember what it was.
You just put it in the chat in a second.
Super. Thanks, Iris. Okay. Thanks, Kelly. Is there anything else, Kelly, you want to say about this? Okay, great. And Iris, while you're doing that, I'm wondering if there's anything else. I mean, you've been so instrumental in shaping this language. Is there anything else you'd want to see here?
I think just the changes mentioned about talking about the things that are not so pretty and not so rosy with communities and explaining them and making sure they're well understood is something that's really important. I also did notice in the questions that Judy's question of does this foster fairness to all living things wasn't included, and I would like to see that as like a question that subcommittees ask. I know we're not in that section yet, but I think that that was a question that she set out that was really important, and I would like to see that reflected.
Nice. Yeah. Yes, let's get into the questions in just a sec and see if the questions are tracking for us. Kelly?
Sorry, that was old.
Oh, okay, sorry, wasn't meant. Okay. Others who want to weigh in, who maybe haven't weighed in? Great. So, like I said, I took a punch list of notes on this, and I'm happy to share it right now. I think, even though I know we're going to even probably change it more when we look at the questions, and these are a little bit messy, so you get a little bit of a messy view here. Let me make it bigger.
Like me to read them again, David?
On these ones, let me do that because they're a little bit like my own thought process, so it may be a little confusing. But the pieces that I heard from a punch list of things, with Chris's idea of getting the implementability of this in here, so he has some specific suggestions that seem to resonate with folks, but getting that into the principles is important. There's a bullet where we can add the word goals, and getting goals out to the community is an important thing. And that's a pretty quick fix, and add that into the fifth bullet on the engagement principles. In the section around, it's the third section, it's important to not just identify inequities, but also rectify and address equities. And so our language needs to make sure people are tracking that and understanding that's where we're going. Identification is step one, dealing with it and rectifying is step two. There's a question that we did not answer, which is the more prescriptive language around moving at the speed of trust. And we didn't quite answer that question, but we talked about some related things that start to get at it. We talked about the importance of accessibility overall, in getting that baked in better. We had specific ideas that we should mention the importance of more than one way to communicate. We can get that in there. And I just cut and paste this from the chat. I think it was Chris's chat about, directly meeting people where they are, again, getting at the accessibility issue. And then this commitment to public education is part of an overall commitment we'd like to see baked in to these principles. So there's a bunch of comments around accessibility that can be improved here. On the candor and honesty piece, we spent some time on that, talking about candor and honesty around impacts, getting that more in the jobs transition section. It's kind of there, it's kind of above. I think there's some work to see if it can be strengthened. Again, the accessibility around job training came up, and noting that we recognize that job training needs to have accessibility, whether that's funding for it or some other way, because we know that people without resources are going to have a hard time accessing training and continuing their lives. And that brought us to this comment of overall being clear that when you communicate, you must communicate commitments that you're making to communities. And it isn't that we necessarily established all those commitments, although our principles are there, but we are saying you need to be, when you're communicating to communities, you need to be showing up with some clarity around the commitments you're making. And then finally, we talked about getting the language back in there about the status quo being inherently inequitable. And then this is a minor change of changing the word plans to recommendations in the document down in the final section. So this is what I wrote for like the changes that should happen in this document. And I welcome folks to feedback if I'm not really capturing what we just said in the best of ways. Is there a better way for me to capture what you were trying to say? Okay. Okay, great. What do you say we go on and read the questions? Because making sure the questions are tracking out of the principles well, and there's nothing missing, like what Iris just mentioned. And I'm wondering, Kaya, if you'd do us the favor once again of, or if you want to delegate to somebody else, absolutely.
No, it's fine. If I may also, there's some conversations in the chat that folks on the phone may not be aware of. So I just wanted to share, I hope that's okay. Just briefly, I'll pick up from where Beverly starts. Beverly placed in there that the recommendation is that job training for impacted and new workers be funded and lead to meaningful and life-sustaining valued work. Life-sustaining valued work. Chris Campany put in the chat, not to continue the conversation, but for context, part of what concerns me is I've never seen a fully just transition happen. The making of whole impacted, closest I've seen is tobacco transition in some states, and that resulted from lawsuits and tobacco manufacturers and importers to the tune of $9.6 billion over 10 years. The peanut quota buyout was funded at $1.3 billion by the feds. Yeah, it didn't make a difference to the tobacco industry, by the way. They just raised the price of tobacco. From Iris, this is the language I suggested: a just transition from status quo. Plans and policies recognize that the status quo and inaction will lead to an unequal future that will exacerbate current inequities and seek to create a more just and a more equitable future for impacted communities through plans and actions. But should suggest that we add it something like this. So tune in. Plans and policies recognize that the status quo and inaction are inherently unjust and will lead to an unequal future where the current inequities are exacerbated. Time for some water for me. Knowing those plans and policies will seek to create a more just, a more equitable future for impacted communities through plans and actions. And then
you don't need to read that. That's the same thing.
Same thing.
I was giving you the tongue twister.
I appreciate y'all. I just want to make sure I'm keeping everybody in the loop as to what we're talking about here today. So that's the piece that Iris has asked if we could add in here. So now going down to our section where we get into the questions. So this section reads Subcommittee Self-Assessment and Policy Design Questions. The following questions were developed by the Just Transition Subcommittee to help each subcommittee put the Just Transition's guiding principles into practice. They aim to better identify, understand, and address the social impacts, types of vulnerable populations, and engagement process of individual policy recommendations. These are not comprehensive, but rather indicative of the analysis required to ensure a just transition for Vermont. So under the category of impacted and frontline communities, what are the frontline and/or impacted communities that might be most impacted by this recommendation? How do these communities experience inequity today around this issue? Can Vermonters hear their voices in the plan? Is the language easily understandable for all? Do you want me to pause or continue?
I would say keep rolling on this one, please.
Analyzing burdens and benefits. Might this recommendation maintain or exacerbate existing inequalities? Which communities bear disproportionate burdens? In what ways does this recommendation ensure that its associated benefits are distributed, and how accessible to various frontline and/or impacted communities? Please name each community and how. Consider the long term. Will this strategy affect financially vulnerable, socially and demographically vulnerable, and geographically vulnerable populations in 10 years, 20 years, and 50 years? I am going to pause. If I may throw in a comment ahead of the line.
Absolutely.
I'm really appreciating all of this. Something I'm really wanting us to do is to work with some of our partners in the disability community to turn this into plain language. I think as a public document, it would be helpful if it's in plain language. Because it's tough for me to read, so it's tough for people to understand. But I get it, you know, so just to name that. So let me stop, and then if we want to pause for questions or comments.
Yeah. Great. I love the idea with better, clearer, plainer language. And I think that is, you know, something to work. If folks have colleagues or people they have worked with who are particularly good at that, that would be wonderful to pull them in. Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Kaya. That's been the drum I've been beating, right? So I appreciate you beating on that drum here too around accessibility in our language. And I think we did okay in the last section of this, maybe not as far as I would love to take it. I'm happy to try and look at the language in this section as well. And certainly at DCF, we don't always do this really well, but we do have some folks who are really good at it when we pull them in. So I'm happy to even pull in those resources to help us think about it.
Thanks, Sarah. That'd be great.
And then I also made a separate comment, and I'm sorry I didn't see this earlier because I did see an earlier version, is I'm wondering if we can not use the language around vulnerable. I know the intent around that, but I think there's different language that we can use that I think is a little bit more strength-based. I'm happy to think about that as well. Maybe others disagree, but that's sort of my gut reaction on that.
Great. I'm conscious of the time, and we were going to try to go to public comment around 5:15, which is not very far away. So I wonder if we want to keep moving forward on the questions and then do an overall gut check of other things that people would like to see changed out of this document in the next steps. So I don't know, Kaya, if you want to keep moving forward on this.
I'm happy to do so if the group's ready to keep going. Okay. So analyzing burdens and benefits. Might this recommend, oh wait, did I read that already? I did. Ensuring equitable and just engagement. How have you and how will you engage frontline and impacted communities around the development and implementation of this recommendation? In what ways does this policy recommendation recognize the different types of knowledge in its design and proposed implementation? Under funding and data, how would this recommendation be funded? And what % of this funding will be allocated specifically to support continued frontline and low-income transition success? What data and metrics will be required to actively monitor the impact of this recommendation on identified communities? How will that data be collected and presented? And then there's two more under implementation and outcomes. So will this recommendation bring fair, high-paying jobs with good benefits to Vermont? How will traditionally underserved Vermonters and unions be prioritized in filling these jobs? How does the recommendation strengthen community trust, cooperation, respect, mutual support, and/or other specific social capital?
Okay. Iris has already mentioned she's missing the question about, is this fair to all people and living beings? I'm paraphrasing that question. Are there other things that you're really missing? Like, this is necessarily a sort of condensed set of questions that takes the spirit of the principles and tries to make them actionable for subcommittees. And yet, are there things that you're really, really missing in this more condensed set of questions? Eris, I see in the chat, Eris is saying this is where a commitments question, right? Are there, sort of, Eris, are you saying, like, are there commitments? Have you been clear about commitments and et cetera, that kind of thing?
More like, what are your commitments?
What are your commitments?
What are your commitments through this recommendation? And not just at the beginning, but throughout and after. Like,
maybe what is your commitment to a just transition, or how does this recommendation express a commitment to just transition?
Yeah, I like that too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And perhaps long-term commitments as well. Like how we have consider the long-term, what kind of long-term commitments, 10 years, going 10 years, 20 years. So how will it benefit? Those commitments will benefit, if we don't see it, different kind of communities may not see a benefit right away, but perhaps there's a commitment that 5 years from now, this is how it's going to benefit them, and 10 years from now, and things like that.
Can I also point out one other thing? This is Eris.
Yeah, sure.
I feel like we're using too short of time frames. Like, we're only thinking within our lifetime. We're not thinking within the lifetimes of the next generation. 50 years from now, likely I'll still be alive. So I would like to see a commitment that really thinks about, what about the next 100 years? What about the next 200 years? Like, are we really, because we are seeing impacts of our ancestors now, hundreds of years later. So I think that's important. I think it's good to think about our time, 10, 20, 50, that's our time. But we really should be thinking much more long-term and asking those questions now as well.
Nice. Thanks. Okay. Are there other pieces around the questions we want to say?
Just
sorry, Liz.
Yeah. I know sometimes that you can be hiding if you're not on the screen. And I'm actually amazed that I didn't think of this before, as I've been staring at these questions for so long. But to Eris's point that she brought up on commitment, I think we are missing a little bit of language still around, like, how was public engagement, public intentions, requests, etc., like considered and reflected in the decision that you made? Because I think we're still getting a little bit stuck on, like, yes, we're inviting public and people with lived experience and people who are going to be around for years and years and years after to, like, have a say, but then what are we doing with the feedback that we're getting? It's not enough just to, like, ask for opinions and be like, great, thank you for your input, but then to turn around, and we can't say yes to every single thing that every member of the public wants and requests, but at least acknowledging it, if not building it into the decisions that we're making.
All right. Okay. And that could easily be tacked on to the piece about how are you engaging? How are you engaging in demonstrating responsiveness to that kind of thing, with the right wordsmith on that. Okay. Anything else? Right. And Sarah, how's this recommendation been shaped by engagement? Right. Okay, so we're getting close to time here. Actually, we're a little over time, but that's okay. And I just want to check if we step back from, we did a deep dive in on the questions and on the principles. The document also has a section around the definitions of frontline communities. It has some definitions around justice and equity. And I'm just doing a temperature check with everybody. How do you feel if we do these changes we just talked about tonight? How are you feeling about this document going out there to the subcommittees as a first, a first effort by this subcommittee in saying, here's our draft, right? We'd like your feedback on it. And we'd like you, as of today, to start to use these concepts in your work. Where's our gut on this right now? Are we ready for that? Are people comfortable doing that? Is there anything else we need to talk about before that happens? Eris says, wait. Can you say a little bit more about that, Eris?
Yeah, I think that, I think we're almost there. I think seeing the changes that we've all discussed today would probably get me to where I'd be like, oh, okay, I feel a little bit better, especially because there are clearly some key things that are still missing. And wouldn't want to put out something ahead of time that's missing some key points and some key nuancing. So especially from, I've been saying this all the time, but the part about commitments, the part about, really implementing and thinking about long-term, changing that language I think is really key to how everybody else is going to start to shape. So I would say I would like to see the suggestions from today's meeting, and then I think that would make my gut not feel so like.
Great, that's helpful to hear. Kaya?
Thank you. So I would say to wait only because I would like to know what the timing is between folks starting to dive into this, even asking their curious questions around this, and when we'll actually get training. It's a different, right. Like there is an intent to try to help support the different subcommittees and having some understandings of, fundamentals around collective liberation and things like that. So, it's a different interpretation you take of a document like this when you've kind of started processing some of that. So that's my only thought, is that right now they may be reactionary, they may be resistant to it because they have not yet started having these kind of conversations that we're having here. And that's making an enormous assumption, but I'm typically right on some of these things. In some spaces, everybody learns. I'm learning all the time. So I don't know it all either. So I just to share that thought.
Yeah. I'm just looking to see if Jane's on the call right now, but yeah, Jane is on the call. So on that point, I think it's interesting because we've been trying to push forward the idea of training, and that's in talking to the Rowan Institute and making that real. And part of what's going to happen is actually in every council meeting, we're going to have a touch point around this starting on Monday. And, Professor Panakar is going to be there and doing some, providing some words of inspiration. And so that's going to start on Monday. And while it's not a training, as you might consider like going to training, that's sort of where that's starting. I wonder if Jane, you want to just say a word more about that?
I'm happy to talk about the training and can do that, but I'm also mindful of time. And Kaya, I kind of want to ask you, Kaya, because I was hearing your suggestion a little differently than what David might have put forward. And I was thinking about a need to articulate the process of rolling this out with the subcommittees and sort of an acknowledgement that there needs to be a space for just transition members who have sat with it and developed it to sit in on subcommittee meetings in other places, which I know you all have liaisons, but thinking about what that responsibility means to those liaisons in like holding up this document and being able to provide and speak to and answer questions around. And that actually, because I'm of a like, let's share it and let's get going. But I am actually recognizing that is actually something we should probably discuss a little bit on how you all feel about being the ambassador for this work to the other subcommittees and how you're going to do that. But yes, and there's also ongoing training conversations more broadly, and we can talk about that later if there's time at the end, or you'll also hear about it at the council meeting on Monday.
I mean, if I may, I think that the biggest piece about that, and I appreciate that, and again, yeah, I don't want to take up too much space and time with this, but just having done these consultations with folks, coming to individuals with a set of guiding principles that they may not have had strong feedback in, they have not created of their own design, they have not gone through the stages of change and understanding to get to the place where this is what resonates out of them as well, can often lead to reactions, like just it's reactionary and can shut down conversation. So just being aware that that will be a dynamic that will have to be triaged if we move too quickly. So not saying it has to go too slowly, but just be ready. Just know that you just need to be ready. So.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm watching the chat as well. And Nadia points out that we didn't circle back on that piece that's in the introduction that references the conversation from last week with Judy. And we didn't get input on that. And I'm particularly interested, folks from Beverly and others who would, who could provide some thoughts, like, are we getting that right? Are we not in the right zone for what was done there? And that is something I think before this goes out, we'd want to do that. And we can do that quickly now, or we could create a space to do that. And just so everyone remembers, it's this section at the front, this text box here. And clearly this concept got translated into the principles as well, right? Because you have this idea in the principles. And as Iris pointed out, it's not in the questions and can be added into those self-assessment questions. But this is, again, we'd want to make sure, particularly Beverly or others that identify here as Indigenous, is this the right way to frame this up, or is this not the right way? And what would be the right way?
I think that it needs to be expanded. There needs to be a different wording, but right now I'm at a loss to try to do that.
Okay. Would you like to work with us on that, or work with the?
Yeah, I would.
That? Okay. So why don't we do that? Let's find a time that's convenient for you, Beverly, and anyone else who wants to join, and see if we can get this in the right place.
Beverly, when it was presented to us at the last meeting, I thought part of the conversation actually started with the soil. And to me, that's a big word that's missing. I know oftentimes earth is kind of equated with, but anyway, that's, I guess the fuller thing that was presented also really got into that. And that's just one word, but that seems to, especially since we're going to be talking as a council a lot about the soil and its role, in all of this. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, I think that, saying the earth and father sky has become such a sort of a catch-all. And the soil that we grow our food from is also really, really important and needs to be considered. So that word does need to be in there somewhere. And I hear that, I hear what you're saying.
I feel like this makes this section, it feels too quick, and doesn't fully give weight to sorry for the pun, but the roots of the Indigenous culture and the way of stewarding the land, and that the focus of being on the land, the soil, and its connection to us. I think that there can be more, it definitely can be expanded. And I think rather than it being an off section in its own square, that maybe it's one of the first paragraphs at the beginning of this whole thing, in the spirit of a land acknowledgement, in that kind of thought process maybe. So yeah, that's what I would say. I think this is just too small, too quick, too almost feels a little, to my grandmother's point, a little too appropriate-y. Like, you know, it's using those kind of catchphrasey words for us, but it doesn't really grasp the understanding of that real spiritual connection. And I think that's what we're wanting to see more of, is like understanding the true spiritual connection of the soil, the earth, to all of us as living beings, not just as us as human beings, but creatures of the planet, even all the creepy crawly ones that I don't like, you know, so they have to be included here too.
Yeah, and reading this, I think that, you know, as a Native woman, the first thing that I think about is we wouldn't be in this mess today if you had listened to my ancestors. Indigenous people have been giving solutions to the problems we're trying to find answers to, but just haven't been listened to. And in some ways, I think we need to go backwards to find those solutions, because they're there. And I feel sometimes that we're just trying to reinvent the wheel. I don't know if that makes any sense, but those are just thoughts, random thoughts that go through my head as I read this.
Yeah. I think this deserves quite a bit more thought than what we can give it tonight. And so I really want to invite folks to give it that thought. So it is hitting the way, you know, it is expressing what you're trying to get across right now.
Yeah.
I'd love to find that space. Okay. So what I've taken away from this is that we've got a set of changes we've talked about making. You'd like to see those changes. You're feeling good about it, and you'd like to see those changes. You have some concerns about how things might be received. And so we need to be thoughtful about when this is transmitted, what accompanies that transmission so that it has a greater chance of landing in the way you intend it to land. So that's what I've taken away from this conversation. There's also an urgency to get this over to the subcommittee so they can work. At the same time, we need to recognize the way it's transmitted and the accompanying pieces to that will make all the difference. Okay. Eris?
I just want to say something to your last point about the urgency of wanting to get it to the committees, the other subcommittees. That is not moving at the speed of trust. And so that means that we are not abiding by our own guidelines if we were trying to push that. So I just want to encourage us to take a second and remember we have to be in integrity and do the same things that we're asking of others to be doing. So let's move at the speed of trust with each other.
Yep. There we go.
I really, really, really appreciate that. My only concern is that the other subcommittees have been kind of patiently or impatiently waiting on us for a while now. And at some point, we kind of need to get the feedback. And that goes back to Kaya's point about, do we release this without training? Because then you're likely to get the pushback because lack of understanding. Because there's still a lot of, you know, within this group, we've had a lot of conversations. We've brought each other up to speed and have done some work before. That's not necessarily going to be the case with the whole council, and certainly not, you know, all the, you know, we have a very large population of subcommittee members. So I don't know where to strike that balance. I'm feeling, and I want to give this all the time that it takes. I'm also just getting nervous about the subcommittees kind of leaving all this behind. I know, but I'll defer to the group. That's my only concern I just wanted to raise. I'm not disagreeing with the Eris. I'm just trying to figure out that balance.
All right. Kaya, last word on this, and then we really do need to press forward because we have our friends from Climate Access and Rise with us tonight. We also need to do some public comment.
Thank you, everybody, for, again, we are trying to live these principles with our candor, and I do recognize that the subcommittees are struggling to find their way through all of this. They're going to be okay. I promise they're going to be okay. Impacted persons have been waiting for centuries. They're going to be okay for like a week or two. And just to acknowledge, and it's fine for us to state very clearly that part of why this has taken as long as it's taken is that we actually had to pull in back some folks that were going to leave this entire process. They were going to leave the subcommittees. They were going to leave the climate council work. Folks from most impacted and frontline communities were going to leave. So we've had to do work to heal because they were in other spaces that weren't doing this work. And we had to do the work to heal to get them back here and engaged in this work. So it is like, it's on all of us. It's on all of us as to why we're running behind. It's not on our committee. It is on the entirety of the climate council as to why we are behind.
All right. So with that, I need to do a quick pause for anyone who's joining us and wants observing our meeting today and would like to make some public comment around this. We can have a space here for public comment. We do need to hear about the public engagement piece that our colleagues from Climate Access and RISE want to do, but I'll just make a pause here. Anybody who's listening in that wants to make a comment on all that we've talked about so far tonight, let's do that right now. I invite folks to make a comment.
David, do you think now would be a good time to talk about the school project, or do you think that could wait till later?
I think why don't we push that maybe even till next week, and if at all possible, because we're going to be a little, or if we have time later before we finish tonight. It's a cool thing, and everyone should hear about it. I think right now, though, we need to keep rocking and rolling. And although, Skylar, if there's things you want to say about what just happened in the principles document and all that, welcome your thoughts on that.
Cool. So I'm happy to wait till next week. I have linked it in my mind in a way to make it relevant, basically with an imaginary of how this sort of thing would be implemented.
And can you quickly introduce yourself as well, Skylar, for folks?
Sorry, yeah. So my name's Skylar. I basically am in the process of starting an organization that's really trying to tackle this question of how would a climate transition be implemented. And I've been working with universities, so it was my hope to have some students present. But the main thrust of what I wanted to talk about is the idea that universities can be a major element of bringing people together and doing the sort of community work that's going to be involved in in the technical transitions. And so maybe it would, I'm happy to wait for next week to talk about it more in depth, but I'd love to get your feedback on a few ideas.
Great. That's great. Well, thanks for being part of this. And let's continue that conversation. Are there other folks that want to speak tonight about everything we've been talking about?
I would, Pat Sagwe.
Hi, Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone for the hard work that is represented in this document. It's nice to see it coming together. I think I will send some things in writing, but how many minutes do I have? Do I have 2 minutes? Do I have 3 minutes?
Well, we really would like to have some conversation around the public engagement stuff. And so a couple minutes.
A couple minutes, all right. Okay,
And written stuff is great, Pat, because that really does go to everybody. So.
And that goes to Jane's, the ANR address. Okay. Just right at the end where people were talking about this tug between getting things to the other subcommittees. I'm wondering about giving them some homework without giving them the document. That maybe some training work, that there are things to prepare them for this conversation that they're going to have, so that it sort of addresses that energy. So I would just sort of popped into my head while people were talking. And so for what it's worth, I was very pleased to hear the references from Beverly and Aris, I think was the young woman's name, it felt like there was a real absence in the material about, for lack of another phrase, the health and integrity of the natural world, that needed to be more than a sidebar. And I look forward to seeing what that looks like. The biggest surprise for me was that rural was was included as a definition of impacted populations throughout the working documents, and it's basically been expunged. It's mentioned in a quote from the Global Warming Solutions Act, and it's not there. And it would be nice if someone could explain that. And there's a couple reasons, there's a couple places it could be put in. Certainly the low-income communities, Indigenous peoples, and Black and other communities of color, and rural communities are among those who are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And the fact that Vermont is mostly rural, people need to understand our impacts are very different than in other places. And it would be nice to get that on the radar in some way. There's also the Vermont version, what I call the Vermont version of marginalization, that has historically been the larger population centers and wealthier small communities sort of pushing off things on low, median income communities. And there are examples, the current landfill being a prime example right now. So, it would be nice to have this tension that has existed for decades and decades in Vermont around who gets marginalized. And it looks different than it does in other places, but I'm hoping that we can acknowledge that a phrase somehow in the questions. I'd be happy to take a crack at something if somebody wants to tell me what, how they would like to do it. But my fear in rural not being called out is that the recommendations will be able to ignore it. And because this is a chronic, decades-long issue in the state, that seems remiss. I know that sounds like a judgment, and I'm sorry, but it seems like an opportunity that we would be missing if we didn't do that. The other sort of high elevation one for me was the comment about energy justice aims to make energy accessible, affordable, clean, and democratically managed for all communities, and that if at a minimum to change clean to cleaner, because there is no clean energy and there isn't going to be for a really long time. There are huge environmental impacts from all energy sources. And so long as we refuse to acknowledge that, we're not in the spirit of this just transitions. Again, this is my vision of what a just transitions looks like. And then the last one that I would like to see a recommendation, consideration that, will this recommendation make Vermonters more vulnerable to trade politics, resource allocation beyond its control? For example, international trade negotiations, which it's going to. So it'd be really nice to have that in there because it's already happening. And anyway, that's the short of it. That's the short list.
Thanks, Pat. And do send in the long list. And if you have specific language, send that in too, because that does get circulated out, not just to Jane, but to the subcommittee. So thanks.
Thank you for letting me speak.
You bet. And anybody else before we transition into the public engagement piece? Anybody else would like to speak? Okay, super. All right. So Sarika, and sorry, and Kara's here. I apologize. We're running so late, so you're going to get compressed a little bit in your time. But I think go ahead and take whatever time you need. If it's 15 minutes, we'll go right up to there. We'll just not do a public comment at the very end. I see all three of you here. Great. So for those who don't know, Kara, Pike, and Meredith from Climate Access, they're here with us, and they were here several weeks ago as well presenting. And then Sarika is from Rise Consulting, which is partnering with Climate Access and here with us as well. So we've asked you to give us an update after all your conversations with the other subcommittees and what you're planning on doing. So I'll turn it over to you, however you want to handle the next 15 minutes or so.
Great, David. Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to hear what the discussion for the past hour and 43 minutes. I feel like there's a lot of alignment around just transitions and what we are trying to do and what we've come here to talk about with you today, which is, and I'm going to just share my screen so that I can share some of this information a little bit visually. So let me see. Can you see a slide or is it blank? You can see it, great. So we are about to start the discovery phase of an audience analysis for the stakeholders. And we're coming to you for advice and guidance on 3 components of this process, which we're hoping to finish, if possible, by the end of June, which is stakeholder interviews, BIPOC sector and community leaders roundtable, and sector and community leaders roundtable. And what we want to do is communicate with these 3 groups so that they can inform the public engagement plan. So in the stakeholder interviews, we want to identify 15 people that we will have 60-minute in-depth interviews with to gain insights on how to talk about and engage different groups across Vermont, to solicit a diversity of perspectives. And our internal targets, and we're very open to adjustment here from Just Transition Subcommittee, is that at least 20% of the interviewees are from BIPOC communities, and that at least 60% of the people we interview are from Vermont's, as you say in the document just reviewed, impacted and frontline communities. These interviews will be confidential. The input that we receive will not be attributed to individuals or organizations. We will summarize them anonymously and use them to inform the public engagement strategies. And interviewees from underrepresented community-based organizations will be offered compensation for their time. And so with this and the other 2 things, what we really want to leave this meeting with is a plan for how to get a list that is vetted and blessed by the Just Transition Subcommittee for us to start reaching out to people. So I'll just talk you through the other 2 sections and then ask Kara and Meredith if they have anything to add, and then we'll take questions. So the next group is the BIPOC sector and community leaders roundtable. So this is the one piece that will be held in an affinity space for BIPOC people only to surface needs, priorities, concerns around communication, climate vulnerabilities, impacts, and resilience building. And our plan is to organize and host 2 online sessions of about 90 minutes to offer participants compensation for their time, to talk to at least 20 people, but certainly many more if that's what this group advises. And I just want to flag that if somebody or multiple somebodies from Just Transition Subcommittee wanted to hold this space with us, we would be really excited about that. And then the second roundtable would be for sector and community leaders. So more generally, not restricted to BIPOC people. And there's certainly people who might fit in either one and they can make a choice whether they want to show up in a BIPOC specific or the general one. Again, to meet with community members from diverse identities and regions in the state to hear from them about priorities, needs, concerns around communication. So same objective, but not in an affinity space. And I'm going to pause there to see if Kara and Meredith have anything you want to add in how I'm characterizing these.
Sounded great to me. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah. I'm just like going fast because I know that the clock is running and y'all have been working so hard, both offline and at this meeting. So we want to co-create this with the Just Transition Subcommittee. You all have so much knowledge and experience, expertise. So what we would love is to have you co-create the list of who is invited to participate in interviews. What we feel very clear about is that we don't want to interview anyone who is a subcommittee council member or somebody, you know, in the legislature who's been involved with the policy pieces. We want to bring in voices that have not yet been engaged directly, and perspectives that you feel are critical to how we design our public engagement plan. And then after we have our list, we'll start outreach. So we're looking for help with the list for all three of those pieces. So the stakeholder interviews and the 2 roundtables. And then before we do those meetings, we would love to share the questions that we have with the Just Transition Subcommittee, and again, get your feedback on that. And then if there's anyone who's interested in co-facilitating BIPOC roundtables, we would absolutely welcome that partnership. And just reflecting on moving at the speed of trust and respecting the workload you all are holding in this work and in your communities. And so these are just suggested dates based on some timelines and targets that we are hoping to get to. And I will just pause here to see if anyone has any questions or thoughts or feedback so far. Sarah, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to make sure I understand who you're wanting to include in your virtual roundtable. So I'm thinking about, I'll use a specific example. I'm thinking about an impacted community of like people living in mobile home parks, right? Like that's it. And so are you looking for someone who maybe works with that community, or somebody who like lives in a mobile home park, or I'm trying to figure, or maybe both, and that's great, but it's a little bit of a different distinction, so I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, Carrie, I'm curious if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so it could be either one, like someone who works with people who live in mobile homes, someone, or all three, someone who lives there, or both. And the idea is really to invite people in who really have an understanding of the key stakeholders that we want to prioritize in the engagement plan, who have insights as to, you know, the best way to talk about the issues, what are the best ways to engage, the channels, the approaches, and have that really inform, as Sarika said, the engagement strategy. So it's really like, who are the influencers and sort of trusted people within these groups that we really want to make sure that we're hearing from, who could help provide those insights for us.
And I just want to contextualize this piece also. So there's who do you think we should spend an hour with? Who should we invite to a roundtable to have more of a group discussion with? And understanding that the people who are not on these lists, we are still going to try to engage different communities and sectors. And so part of the ask is prioritizing. Like, so I have created a draft list of priority people, particularly around groups that have been traditionally underrepresented or face disproportionate impacts. And I mean, there's so much knowledge in this room. I'm sure you're going to find holes and you'll have a lot to add to that. But for example, mobile home parks, communities and folks who work with them are on that list. 2 groups that get left out a lot that have differential vulnerabilities are folks who are incarcerated, the LGBTQ population. Certainly we have different BIPOC communities listed out individually. And so what we're asking is for you to help us really prioritize who we're going to spend that hour with and offer names even and recommendations. We'll give you a draft list. And we've also asked each of the other subcommittees who we need to engage in general. So there is a spreadsheet with all of those recommendations. And then we'll be sharing a document that has my recommendations based on my knowledge as a BIPOC Vermonter who does environmental work, which again is not complete. And I believe that with this collaboration, we will get a much better list.
I might add in, Sarika, that also the goal of this early phase of engagement is developing an engagement plan for all the work that'll be done as, you know, recommendations are coming out from the subcommittees and all that stuff, right? So this is this is leading towards, an engagement strategy that then you'll go and implement, going far beyond these groups that you're aiming to do in this phase 1. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it's sort of very similar to the document that you were reviewing, really emphasizing our attention on impacted communities in this space so that they are centered throughout the whole process. And I think there's a sort of secondary objective, which is to just hear what people's concerns around risks and vulnerabilities are, in case there's anything there that needs to be raised. It's just another input of information, because in a lot of processes that isn't done. So it feels like we're folding that into the community engagement to some extent. It's asking people what they care about.
Right.
So we don't have as much time as we thought we would. And it feels like weird to just throw up a doc right now on a screen share and have you all look at it and try to fix it together. So I'm wondering if a next step could be to share a document that sort of contextualizes what we're asking of you. And then, yes, we will share that list, and then asking you all to add to it and adapt to it. And I guess my question for you all is it asking too much of you to give us final lists, or a list that well, I'll stop there. Does that feel like a fair ask for you to review what we have, add to it, change it, and give us back who you would like us to reach out to?
The 26th, was that the date you had on this slide?
It's a suggestion, and I wanted to hear back. I know y'all have been working hard on this other document, so checking in there.
Well, and I think there's really like 2 pieces. So the spreadsheet that it has, we asked each subcommittee, what stakeholders do you think should be engaged in the specific work of your subcommittee? And which stakeholders do you feel should be involved with the planning process as a whole? And so that's in that spreadsheet. And so adding your thoughts to that, as well as to the document that Sarika just mentioned, would be great, because, again, to the point that even if we don't include people in these initial interviews and roundtables, we still want your ideas on overall with the engagement, who should be prioritized. And obviously we have a good sense of that from the conversation, the great conversation that was just had. Yeah.
I wonder, as a matter of process, to help move things forward, I wonder if you're sharing that document and everybody has the opportunity to add in information, that sounds great. Knowing this group, they are going to want to sort of see, we are going to want to, as a group, see that list and discuss it maybe at our next meeting. That's my inclination. And I wonder too, if maybe there's a couple folks who might be willing as a small group to sort of help take that giant list, work with you to bring sort of something to our next meeting, if that feels like a good process that keeps it moving forward. Or if that's in sync with what you guys were thinking.
And is your next meeting Thursday, the 27th? Okay.
Are there folks who would want to be part of that? Maybe work with Sarika and the team to pull some ideas together and synthesize. Abby, you want to go ahead?
I have just a quick question. So I'm looking at the document that you've provided or that you linked to, and there are a bunch of individuals and organizations identified under question 3. Are there leaders who represent, anyway, that you think should be involved? Are you asking that we go through that list and identify which we recommend for the interviews and which we would recommend for the stakeholder engagement, or to brainstorm a separate list for one or both of those?
Yeah,
trying to figure out how this document helps our group in the tasks that you're asking us to play.
So the spreadsheet summarizes the input from the other subcommittees on
who should be involved with your subcommittee work and the plan in general. Having you add into that would be great. And you'll see it as a mix of just sort of general categories, organizations, and individuals that were recommended. We're gonna, once you've been able to do that, we're gonna go back through and sort that. So it's really clear, like what stakeholders are really, you know, engaged around a particular subcommittee's work. Where are there overlaps? Like 3 different subcommittees want to be engaging the same stakeholders. So how do we make sure that's organized? So that's the first document. And then the second is the one that Sarika put together that has the recommendations for who to interview and include in the roundtables to shape the public engagement plan. And so having you weigh in on that as well would be fantastic.
And it looks like Amanda has volunteered to maybe work with me to get ready for next week's meeting. And Kaya as well.
Yes, it's just for the point of clarity and for disclosure, Rights and Democracy and Rejoice and Center for Whole Communities have been granted an award through DEC to think about community engagement. So it's our intention to try to work in concert together. So we're also not doing separate work. So I think it would be important for us to kind of see where the worlds combine and how we can expand this work.
Great. So it looks like Kaya and Amanda and I can circle up and make sure that we come up with a plan for going through this list with the group next week, and maybe leaving with recommendations, which might include sharing info and having people do some work beforehand so that we're ready to finalize next Thursday. Does that sound reasonable?
Seeing head nods. Great. Yeah. Okay. So that's great as a next step. Kai, is that a new hand or old hand? Just checking in. Old hand. Okay. So Sarika and Kara and Meredith, is that enough for tonight in terms of like getting in the right place? You and Amanda and Kaya can work. This can be on this subcommittee's agenda next Thursday, and you can dig into it even further. That seemed like a good path forward for you guys. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to suggest, Nadia and others, that what we do at this point is we just adjourn. And there was another piece on the agenda around, updates from other subcommittees, another period of public comment. I would say in the interest of time that we would adjourn, but Nadia, I'd leave it up into your hands because I think you're officially in charge tonight.
Thank you. And I wanted to defer that question actually to Jane to see if there's anything that is time sensitive for the subcommittee.
No, all set. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
With that, thanks so much to everyone for joining us, and the meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. That was a big meeting, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
guys.
everybody. Good work.
Have a good one.
Bye,
Have a good one.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.